A few years ago, a friend of mine visited a very remote town somewhere in Africa. He was going there because he'd heard that some interesting sociological phenomenon had happened in this town, this small village. So he gets there and he's with a translator and he spends 3 days there observing what's happening inside this community. And after 3 days, he still can't work out what goes on in terms of the dynamics because there's no set leader, but decisions seem to get made quite easily and things seem to function quite well. And while there's no set leader, there are two people in the village who have these marks on their forehead, and they have the same marks on the huts where they live. So after 3 days, he asks his translator to ask the people in the village, what's going on? Who are these people who have these marks on their forehead, and what do they mean? And the translator came back after asking the villagers and said, well, there's an unspoken law in this community that when someone gets to a certain level of accumulative wealth, they throw a big feast until they become the so-called poorest. And then they get the mark on their foreheads and their huts as a sign of respect for that action. Now, anthropologists will tell you that's the potlatch or the potluck. In the Western modern phraseology, the potluck, where people bring what they have to a dinner. And it's actually meant as a redistributionary mechanism. It's the inbuilt, not-for-profit ethic that saw communities survive, and to this day survive, through many, many, many challenges because of the inbuilt mechanism of redistribution of wealth. Now, not many people know that it was only 400 or so years ago that the ethic on which communities engaged and economies ran shifted. The ethic shifted along the spectrum from a not for private profit, not for private gain ethic, in it for the community ethic, through to a notion of private gain. You see, 600, 700 years ago in Western cultures anyway, the notion of private gain was something that was seen from a religious perspective as something that would necessitate damnation. It was not culturally accessible to flaunt wealth, to accumulate wealth, etc. And that shifted through the Renaissance period and around then. And it shifted quite slowly in some respects and fast in others. But the part that's most of interest to us now in our present day is what happened over the last 40 to 50 years. In that period, we saw a massive rush towards the private for-profit ethic. The notion that economies run best when people put their individual gain first, and that is the most efficient way to organise activities, organise a market, is for people to be in it for themselves and for self-interest to actually develop in a way that drives our economic activity. Now, this, of course, got pushed further and further with neoliberal reforms, and in this country, with Thatcherism and Reaganism from the US, there was a push in that direction towards the idolisation of private profit as epitomised most by the large corporate, the shareholder-driven company that would privatise profit and gain. But the challenge with this narrative, whether or not it's critiqued in terms of market regulation or deregulated industry, because essentially these days we're still talking about a for-profit world, and I'll speak to that in a second, is that it hit limits. We're currently facing two external crises, and they're two external crises of the for-profit capitalistic system. And for-profit and capitalistic systems are interchangeable, they're interwoven. The for-profit motive, the notion of private enterprise and private gain, is now embedded in our understandings of capitalism, whatever shade they are. So the two crises with which you'll be all too familiar, but are important to link to the for-profit motive, are the crises of financial inequity, whereby now double the size of this room's population, 85 or so people, have control over the equivalent wealth, the wealth equivalent to that of half the world's population, 3.5 billion people. 85 people, 3.5 billion people, control of the same wealth. World record highs in terms of inequality. This we know. What less people do is make the connection with the second external crisis that we're facing. That is one of ecological devastation. So we're familiar with climate crises more than we need to be. But what we're not familiar with is how the for-profit motive actually underlies the climate crises we're facing. Here's how it works. Financial for-profit systems essentially privatize wealth, and in doing so, create financial inequity and social stratification. If they didn't, then there wouldn't be the for-profit motive. It wouldn't work. It's built into the system that some people are going to get wealthier and others not, no matter how much taxation comes into that system. That's what is said to drive that system. That's the story of the for-profit narrative. So you have this social stratification, and with that comes two phenomena. The first is that you get status envy and aspirational drive. So when I've spent time in various parts of the world, you commonly will see through the marketing, billboards, etc., that push from corporates and then from each other as a result in that co-evolutionary process to consume more, to become more, to be like the Joneses, etc. We're familiar with this. The other is that this social stratification, which concentrates power at the top, also creates the situation, the context that is conducive to corporates controlling the dialogue and the options of people in terms of what you consume. So for some people, sustainability is not even an option. They live on a very small wage that only allows them to buy X, Y, Z, or only allow them to have access to certain information. So we have this social stratification that creates the status envy and the aspirational motivations, as well as forced necessity in terms of choices. And these things are fundamental to the for-profit narrative, to the for-profit ethic. So financial inequality is linked inextricably to ecological degradation. Now, what gets put forward as the alternatives? First of all, you have market regulation, right? Common in this country with a long history of the labour movement that you would have people saying, we need to curb the market's excesses. But underlying this is still an addiction to the for-profit narrative. Because as I mentioned earlier, if you taxed, for example, at the full amount required to ensure that there wasn't a widening divide in terms of financial wealth within a country, then you'd have no incentive for innovation in that system. That's what drives that innovation in that system, is the notion that you can get rich compared to others. And that's what creates that relative inequality, which is so important on the status envy side of things. And we also know that when governments try to regulate an area, that what happens is they often cozy up with big business, and they're in cahoots in that way, and it ends up just being window dressing. The regulation is just window dressing for business as usual. The alternative that gets put forward in some other spheres, usually in more financially conservative spheres, in areas like platforms like Harvard Business Review, is the notion that we can have creative capitalism, conscious capitalism, capitalism with a soul, philanthrocapitalism. You could just keep throwing them out in terms of the names that they keep coming up with: green capitalism, sustainable capitalism. And with this you have methods that people put forward like shared value and B Corps, social enterprise with very much a for-profit flavour. But you see here, we've got the same challenge. From a systems perspective, it's still relying on a for-profit narrative. And it's a narrative where profit is seen as an end, not just a means to an end. And whenever you put profit as an end, you're setting your society up for collapse. Wealth inequities lead to social inequities, lead to overconsumption, social dislocations, social breakdown that we're all too familiar with. And so these answers that get put forward are actually answers that hold at their centre the very mechanism by which the problems are being created in the first place. Amazingly, this hasn't been looked at very much. Most people look at business systems in different ways, and they don't compare, for example, the difference between a for-profit distributing cooperative and a not-for-profit distributing cooperative. Not all cooperatives are born equal. The amazing thing, though, is that while we've had this privatisation push, the deregulation globally across pretty much every sector, and while we've had austerity in the UK and financial crises, numerous in the last 40 years, while this has happened, an incredible phenomenon has been rumbling away in the background that's now coming to the fore. It's the rise of not-for-profit enterprise. So 40 years ago, if you were involved with a not-for-profit organisation or a non-profit or a charity, chances are that its financing would have been from grants or philanthropy of some sort. But in the last 15 to 20 years, that has changed dramatically, such that 53% of income for not-for-profits across the 26 countries surveyed by Johns Hopkins University, including the UK, USA, Australia, showed 53% of not-for-profit income comes from self-generated revenue. What does that mean? Well, let's look at one of the world's biggest not-for-profit organisations. It's called BRAC. It's in Bangladesh. It works in the health, education, finance areas. Employs around 100,000 people, largely women. Has an annual turnover of $432 million from memory. It's a big organisation. What was its source of revenue? 80% of BRAC's revenue was self-generated because it ran craft stores, bakeries, printing presses, and a dairy. The world's biggest, one of the world's biggest not-for-profit organisations, especially in terms of employment, is an enterprise. It's not a charity as such. And that is what has been changing in the last 30 years in incredible ways. In the UK here, I was just in a co-working space this afternoon called Create, and I'm sitting across the desk from a person she was on the phone, and I heard her talking about her company. It's called Co-Wheels. Now, Co-Wheels is a not-for-profit enterprise. They run car pickup services so that you can rent a car, right? Car sharing services. Set up as a not-for-profit, in this country most commonly as a CIC, a community interest company, limited by guarantee, as compared to the for-profit version, which is the company limited by shares. So you've got these newly emerging entities, and there are hundreds of thousands of them, and they're massive and they're small. Hansalim in South Korea, 230,000 members, largely women, in the food services area. They run food distribution. I think they've got laundry and clothing services as well. You have Ebico here in the UK, a not-for-profit energy provider. And what these do is they differentiate themselves from for-profits because instead of privatising profit, so in a for-profit, wealth gets made and you have profit at the end of the year after administrative costs have been paid, and that wealth goes out, is extracted from the system into the pockets of shareholders or owners. In a not-for-profit, you have social profits because the profits go back in. They're reinvested either into the organisation or into the community through philanthropy or other means. So the difference between private profits and not-for-profits is critical in terms of looking at sustainability in the future. Now, not-for-profits have been on this incredible rise in part because the game has changed when it comes to business setup. So years ago, if I wanted to set up a not-for-profit organisation that might be a digital communications company, for example, then I would have had high capital costs to start. And it would have probably meant that I would have been outcompeted from the outset with an equivalent for-profit. But the digital revolution has brought the cost down dramatically when it comes to business setup. I used to work in the nanotechnology field, and there, for example, a clean room in which a scientific laboratory was set up in Costa Rica for just a few $100,000, both because the costs of production have come down and continue to come down, but also because they tap into things like open source technologies, where plans and data is opened up. And so instead of paying licenses for things, you actually have access without those costs. And so costs have been coming down. And at the same time, if I was setting up my digital agency years back, I probably would have needed to gain some startup capital in order to get that started. And that wouldn't leave me many options beyond the grant route or the venture capital route, which meant I would have had to go for profit. But these days, as you know, we have crowdfunding, we have revenue-based finance as well, which means, for example, that if my not-for-profit wants to get some seed money, someone will give me that money on the basis of, if I succeed, I'll give them a very big return, a fixed rate, and if I fail, that's the risk they take. So it's like a loan, but it's like a loan mixed with venture capital principles. But it allows now not-for-profits, this is happening, for example, in California, not-for-profits to emerge in a space in terms of risky finance for startup. And then we have community bonds, most prevalent in Canada, where a bunch of community like this would all put in 100 quid as a loan for a startup for a not-for-profit. And then, of course, you've got your traditional routes, your social finance, your general banking finance, etc. So the game has changed because now not-for-profits are in a space where they can actually enter markets that were previously inaccessible. So you have, for example, Wikispeed. It's a not-for-profit car manufacturing company based out of Seattle in Washington in the US. The typical car company takes around 30 years to iterate a design. So the car that you were traveling in the past month, that design, in terms of that model, would have been on a 30-year plan in terms of its changing. Wikispeed takes 8 days to iterate. And it does so because it taps into a global resource of knowledge of people giving feedback on the designs and the testing. It's a distributed manufacturing system. It's a little like open source ecology and the Factor E farm in Missouri run by Marcin Jakubowski. And there he's pulled in a team from around the world that uses scrap metal and open source design, as in the design code is open and freely available for people to iterate. He combines these two to create prototypes of the 50 machines that are central to industrial production. Just pause for a second and think what that means in terms of the way we run our economies. For 30, 40 years, knowledge has been tied up in the private profit sphere. Today, things like companies that are for-profit, like Tesla, are starting to open up as well. So there is a shift happening generally in the industry, but it's being driven by not-for-profits, like Mozilla Firefox, a not-for-profit. And when you download Mozilla, it says, because we're a not-for-profit, we're more able to innovate. Why? Well, a number of reasons, but primarily because they don't have shareholders that they have to be paying dividends to and driving profit maximization to satiate. But also because they engage open source and draw on feedback from the community more regularly. Also because they have flatter organizational structures that are more common with not-for-profit enterprises when compared to both for-profit companies and compared to non-profit, charity, old-school model companies. Where is this all going? Well, interestingly, capitalism has an inbuilt mechanism for its own destruction. The arc of the economic universe bends towards equality, and thank God. And the way that happens is that all of those gains that came, the wonderful gains that came on the back of capitalism in terms of our technological developments, some of them perhaps needing more critique than others. But what they've done is they've set up the bed for capitalism's death, because now the not-for-profit enterprise is in a position to be able to compete with the for-profit enterprise in that space. How do they compete? Well, they have financial, human resource, governance, market position and productivity advantages. Some of these will be more obvious than others. So if you have a not-for-profit and a for-profit business, take for example a bank in the US that's for-profit and a credit union in the US, which by law is not-for-profit. And there are 100 million members of credit unions in the US, so we're not talking about a small part of the banking system here. You take those two banks, the credit union has tax deductibility, has tax exemptions as a not-for-profit. The credit union has the ability to engage volunteers in a much more passionate kind of way. They usually engage people, and this is synonymous with the not-for-profit sector, who are more passionate about the work they do. And this ties in nicely with what Dan Pink refers to as the rise of purpose-driven motivation. And they also are able to be more innovative because of those flatter structures, because it's easier to be more participatory when you're A, usually smaller and more local and connected in with your customers, and B, when your primary ethic is to fulfill social needs. That's what a not-for-profit is. That's what a not-for-profit does. Whereas in the big banks, if you've got something to say about what's wrong with the bank, they're a lot less interested in what you've got to say unless it addresses their bottom line. So we're seeing this in terms of this innovative potential now in the ways that not-for-profits are out-competing for-profits as well. In the UK, for example, not-for-profit gymnasiums and leisure centres are dramatically out-competing the equivalent for-profit gymnasiums and fitness and health clubs. And it's because of all these reasons that it's able to do that. There's a lot that we can cover perhaps in the questions, whether it's about how does a not-for-profit economy work in the future in terms of taxation, in terms of the way systems operate in relation with each other. But at the heart of it, I want to leave you with two things and then a little story. The first is that we've been wondering for so long. I mean, the Occupy movement was there, thousands of organised events around the world involving millions of people, calling for change, yet not knowing what they wanted to call for. No real defined alternative. And the alternatives that get put forward, ultimately, from everything that I've seen so far, fall short. Why? Because they don't understand the need for a redistributionary mechanism that's not imposed. If we try to impose this on people, we move very much in the direction of communism. If we try to impose this on people, how do we think we can draw out the best nature in humans? And I know from talking with many of my friends who are extremely wealthy, who are part of the 0.1%, they have fundamentally good motivations, a lot of them, that are waiting to be borne out. That's part of this new story of reconnecting, as the research is doing, with a deeper understanding that within us, within the right conditions, we have the capacity for empathy and for cooperation. The research is continually showing that now in opposition with what we've been told and what's underlied our economics for the last 30 to 40 years. So we can't impose this. But neither can we have some kind of idealistic situation where a speaker gets out at the front of a room and says, hey, wouldn't a not-for-profit world be amazing? A world in which every business has as its primary motivation the fulfillment of social needs. Wouldn't that be great? That wouldn't be enough. So the second part of this is that it has a level of probability, almost inevitability built into this, because not-for-profit enterprises, the data shows, are increasingly outperforming and taking market share from for-profits around the world, such that in the last 15 years, or in fact from 2001 to 2011, so throughout the financial crises, not-for-profits off a base of about 1.2 million organisations grew 25% over those years in the US, as compared to the for-profit sector, which grew 0.5%. This movement, this rise of not-for-profit enterprise, is happening in ways that I predict by 2050 will see us living in a world in which not-for-profit business is the central business model, activity, etc., in terms of the way that we organise our activities. And this is important because I want to leave you with a final story that highlights the essential message here around the way that we need to organise our economics. Joseph Heller, who wrote the book Catch-22, was at a party with his friends out on an island, and the island was owned by his wealthiest friend, who was a banker, and he was having a drink with another of his friend who came up and said, "Joseph, don't you feel upset being here?" And Joseph said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, this friend of ours who's having this party, he earns more in one day than you will earn in your entire life, even with all of your book sales." And Joseph said, "Doesn't bother me." And his friend said, "Why is that?" And Joseph said, "Because I have something that he will never have." And his friend said, "What's that?" He said, "Enough." Thanks.